Hey guys, Tower Climber here, and today we're going to be doing a full explanation on what Shinsu is in the Tower of God story and go into a full deep dive into how almost everything about it works. Of course, things that I talked about in different videos like the Shinszu qualities will be left for those videos to explain, and mostly because I already made those videos and I think those videos are well enough to stand on their own and have enough information to really just go watch them themselves, and I think they're still pretty well made. But aside from that, this is going to be the basic knowledge, full deep dive into what Shinsu is in the Tower of God story. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. Shinsu, which literally translates to divine water in Korean, is a substance native to life forms within the tower. Shinsu exists everywhere inside the tower, no matter where you are, and Shinsu does not flow from the outside of the tower, but is rather created and produced by the tower itself. Shinsu can even exist in a sort of vacuum-like state, kind of like how we saw in the Floor of Death arc, and as of now in the current point of the story, what Shinsu consists of is unknown and probably will stay unknown for the entirety of the series, but we do know that it flows through the surroundings like air would in our world, but of course a bit different as well, as air is a real concept in the overall Tower of God world, and we know for a fact that it exists outside the tower. Ashul Waru, the man who made the 13-month weapons, even interviewed irregulars who came from the outside to try and learn the differences between air and Shinsu, and wrote it in his book called Of the Tower's Weapons. In short, air and Shinsu do have a few things in common, as they both flow throughout their surroundings and are essential for all living things in each of their respective worlds. They both allow for breathing and provides moisture for the inhabitants. Leroro even stated that within the tower, Shinsu basically all but replaces air and carries out all the purposes that air would, as Shinsu can take the form of air, or at least close enough to let everyone survive. I would say the biggest fundamental difference between air and Shinsu is the laws by which both of them operate on. What I mean by this is that unlike air, which conforms to the laws of pressure when flowing, Shinsu has no unifying laws to it. It flows and behaves entirely differently in different places, no matter the height or pressure of the area. Sometimes it becomes a gas, and other times it becomes a liquid, depending on various factors like the floor's environment, Shinsu density, and of course, the laws that the guardian of the floor make. The flow of Shinsu is the most important thing to it, as that's what determines its qualities, allowing it to appear as almost anything like water, fire, light, and any other phenomenon or material. So what I'm trying to say by all of this is that basically Shinsu has no singular property or feature and is rather the very basis of all energy and things within the tower's walls. Getting into a little bit more of the history behind Shinsu, Shinsu has been an integral part of the tower most likely ever since it was created, and be you strong or weak, ranker, regular, or otherwise, if you run out of Shinsu, you will die. The only somewhat contradiction to this are irregulars, as when we how Joe was sucking the Shinsu from everything in the Floor of Death, Yurik seemed to be not affected by it, while all the other regulars and rankers were still affected on the Floor of Death. This could be explained away by Yurik being from the outside of the tower and not truly needing Shinsu to survive. I did make a Halloween video on this topic when I discussed in that third video what are souls and demons in the Tower of God world. So if you guys want to go watch that one, you can, as I think I go a little bit in depth on why that actually happened to all the tower inhabitants and not to Yurik. But since that's a theory of mine and not really backed up by anything fully yet in canon, I'm not going to include it in this video, as these are all just things we fully have 100% confirmation of in the story. An interesting thing to point out is that the first person to systematically study Shinsu was Po Bidao Gusting, head of the Po Bidao family. All terminology, standards, and units used to describe Shinsu in the story of Tower of God originated from Gusting's works. Shinsu can be utilized in a multitude of ways, given you have the skills, knowledge, resistance, and just natural talent in many cases. Through Shinsu, one can extend lifespans, halt the aging process, control natural elements, and even attain the powers of what one would call a god. But to clearly focus on one aspect I really want to touch on, let's talk about Shinsu resistance now, as it's a big aspect to how people do anything in the tower, and even more if you are climbing it. Shinsu resistance is an ability that allows you to resist a certain amount of density or viscosity of Shinsu. Basically, because Shinsu can be many things in the tower, Shinsu resistance could be defined as an ability to withstand a certain amount of almost anything or possibly everything made up of Shinsu, given that your resistance is high enough, of course. course. Now, just like how everyone in the tower uses Shinsu to live, all tower inhabitants such as divine sea fish, humans, and other species have varying amounts of Shinsu resistance. But there are also some individuals who have side effects to high concentrations of Shinsu. If the density is so much higher than one can withstand, it can cause pain, nausea, bleeding, or even death to an individual. But a high level of Shinsu resistance allows somebody to enter and move around in areas with a certain amount of Shinsu density without incurring too much, if any, restrictions to their movements at all. One can also try to force themselves through a barrier with a density somewhat higher than what their body can withstand, but they might suffer some injuries like bleeding, like how we saw with Serena and Shibisu in season 1. But talking a little bit more about Shibisu, he's a great example about how just climbing the tower is a great way to expand one's Shinsu resistance, as he used to be able to barely go through a Shinsu wall on the 2nd floor, but now can walk around normally on the Shinsu density of the 52nd floor, meaning current day Shibisu could not have only gone through the wall like it was the easiest thing in his life to do, but also be completely not affected by Lero changing the density to that of the 30th floor like he did to that random regular in season 1. Like some other skills in the tower, Shinsu resistance can be a hereditary trait among the tower's inhabitants, especially those from the 10 great families that hail from the bloodlines of irregulars that also have amazing Shinsu capabilities. For instance, Juri Jahan has an unnaturally high Shinsu resistance from birth, so she almost never experienced any restriction to her body's movements no matter where she was. There are ways for one to boost resistances through your life. Like I said, climbing the tower itself is a good way, but if one lives in high density areas for a long time and adjusts to them like Rack, who likely hunted on divine sea fish in areas of high density throughout their early lives, that could also prove to be very useful to them, as then when you go to an earlier floor, that's not really going to affect you that much. The last real way you can really gain an affinity to Shinsu resistance that we learn in the story is through certain items to get a better resistance, like Love's glove inventory or Hayura's suitcase, which allowed her to not be stopped by reverse flow control. Shinsu is normally not visible to the naked eye unless it's highly concentrated, manifested in large amounts, or is manipulated using a Shinsu technique. But for now, let's look into the first way I just mentioned, which are exceptional areas within the tower where Shinsu is highly concentrated naturally, and this can be on any floors, not just higher ones. A perfect example of this is the white steel eel's cage on Head-On's floor, which although it's the first floor of the tower, it had Shinsu levels of the 20th floor or higher. These locations will appear to be submerged in liquid Shinsu and can be hazardous to enter for those who lack Shinsu resistances and adequate combat skills to defend themselves against the divine sea fish that often inhabit these areas. So if you ever find yourself in the Tower God world, I would tell you to stay clear of these areas and train yourself up until you are able to move around easily in these areas. Now, by what I meant earlier that these areas can be on any floor is that each floor of the tower increases in what we call Shinsu density. It may not seem that much different on a floor by floor basis, but if you are exposed to the regular base Shinsu density of a floor that is higher than your current level of Shinsu resistance, you will most likely have a very bad time and could die from the shock of the pressure alone. But again, these are what I call base Shinsu densities, what is regular on a given floor. That is why Shinsu that is said to be the regular density of the 30th floor looks so much thicker on the 2nd floor than what it would normally look like on the 30th, as it would just look like normal air on that floor. So for example, if Lero did that move where he turned the Shinsu density to that of the 30th floor on the 30th floor, it would do nothing, as it would just be changing the Shinsu density to the same as the floor he is already on, and it would just be completely useless to do that. Now we're going to get into the part most people are probably looking for in this video, and that is of course the Shinsu manipulation. This is the ability to externally manipulate Shinsu to change the environment, to attack an opponent, or to carry out other actions such as flying or levitation. The wave controllers are the best at manipulating Shinsu in battle and have the easiest time doing so, but they are very clearly not the only positions that do so, as all the positions in the tower do manipulate Shinsu in one way or another. Again, I talk a little bit about what the positions themselves do in their own dedicated video, so go see that if you want to know all the intricate details on each position, as it's not all focused on just Shinszu, but all positions in one way or another. Of course, some more than others use Shinszu, but the wave controllers are the ones that Shinszu is their main primary weapon beyond everything else. Before getting into the two major types of Shinszu manipulation, let's look at how you even get to control Shinszu in the first place, and that is through making a contract with a Florist Guardian to be able to do so. And interestingly, in regards to items, only items that have already had a contract made with a Guardian can be used. So for example, an item that has a contract with the Guardians of the 2nd to 30th floor cannot be used on the 31st floor. And don't go thinking just because you made a contract with your Guardian, that means you can manipulate Shinszu anywhere on the floor, since after a contract has been made with a Guardian, one must uphold several terms and conditions, just like a real contract. If you violate any of these rules, the contract is considered to have been broken and your rights are taken away, making the contract null and void. The strictness of these rules varies between Guardians to Guardians. All of this mostly just applies to regulars climbing the tower, as in terms of the contract that rankers and high rankers have, it can be said that they are nearly completely free of restrictions. The biggest ones they have though are that they cannot really meddle in the affairs of most regulars climbing the tower, without of course getting in trouble with the Guardian of the floor. Also, it's very important for me to point out that some things that we have already talked about, like an innate resistance to Shinszu or other things like that, are all natural abilities that one can have and thus do not require contracts. Contracts are merely for the act of manipulating Shinszu, not anything else. So yeah, Shinszu resistances don't matter to this contract at all. That's just something you basically have in your body from the start. Another thing to bring up is that the Tenguid families, their numerous branch families, and a few other special families in the tower have a higher chance to be born already being able to control Shinszu. This doesn't mean they don't have a contract. This just occurs because they are considered to have a contract at birth. It is also known that there is only one place in the tower where Shinszu can be freely manipulated without a contract, this being the 43rd floor, as the previous Guardian was killed by Enryu the Irregular. Mentioning Irregulars now, the God of Guardians confirmed that only Irregulars have the authority to control Shinszu without contracts nor restrictions, and that is why they are able to use abilities like the Shinszu Black Hole Sphere or Spatial Distortion. Basically because they have the ability to control Shinszu freely, they also have the ability to control it at a spatial level. When controlling Shinszu, there are two major types of methods of manipulating it. Let's begin with flow control, as it's the most common in the series. Basically, although there is no exact predictable pattern to the flow of Shinszu, Shinszu does momentarily flow in certain directions. So one can effectively manipulate Shinszu by reading and encouraging the flow in a desired direction. Once a person begins to control Shinszu in one direction, it becomes very difficult to change said direction unless you're very skilled. The greatest advantage to flow control is that it allows the manipulator to control a large amount of Shinszu without too much effort, and compared to reverse flow control, this normal flow control is much faster and the user can control larger amounts of it, and sometimes one can even take advantage of the flow of an enemy Shinszu to make it their own. Of course, the most important part to all of this is reading the flow of Shinszu and finding the optimal point to then control it. It's also worth to note that every organism within the tower has an individual flow of Shinszu. By using this flow, one can heal themselves or others, enhance their physical capabilities, or grant numerous other abilities. Of course, since this is possible, the opposite is also very likely to happen. If you strengthen or speed up the flow of Shinszu within your own body, you can strengthen the speed or power of your own body, but you can also inflict a proportional amount of eternal damage to yourself. This also applies to others. If you control your enemy's flow of Shinszu beyond its limits, your enemies could be reduced to nothing but a sack of skin, like a popped water balloon. Now transitioning over to reverse flow control, the biggest thing to note about this form of Shinszu control is that it's slower than normal flow control, and thus generally means the user can only control a smaller amount of Shinszu in comparison to flow control. An easy example is that Bomb could use flow control to take out 5 people, but could only use reverse flow control to stop 1 person. Reversing the Shinszu flow allows the user to completely dictate the flow of Shinszu, and is normally used in the series to stop an enemy or an enemy's attack coming at somebody. Using reverse flow control requires more caution when compared to normal flow control. In fact, to use reverse flow control, you need to be able to read the flow of Shinszu more accurately than you would for flow control, because you are instead breaking, blocking, or shattering the flow and making it your own, and changing the flow of Shinszu in the wrong ways can be unintentionally very destructive. The lighthouse is one of many items in the tower that can use reverse flow control. So if you're a light bearer, you can probably use this skill more readily available than other people in the tower. Now that we have talked about both of these methods, why don't we talk about what happens when one person uses them both at the same time? This does not mean the same thing as just making two bangs of Shinszu with different effects. Of course, using different kinds of control in each bang is a difficult task, but you are only considered to have this talent if you can use both flow control and reverse flow control at the same time. While difficult, mastering and using both forms of control provides a massive boost in efficiency and power. The best example for this in the story is the floor butterfly piercing technique. This technique is super dangerous and very damaging, as once your body is in the contact of your opponents, you forcibly reverse flow control the Shinszu in your opponent's body by accelerating the flow of Shinszu inside your own body. Then you flow control the returning shock inside your own body to protect yourself from the backlash. This is a very dangerous technique that destroys everything in contact with your body while leaving you completely unharmed. Now that we got all this out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about that terminology we learned about earlier. There are going to be 4 terms you're going to hear if you are trying to learn and control Shinszu. These being bang, myun, sung, and tension. Let's start with bangs. They are the basic unit in which Shinszu control is measured. So the more bangs one can control, the more skilled at manipulating Shinszu one is judged to be. But as a general note, as the number of bangs increase, control becomes more difficult. Overdoing the handling of bangs can physically and mentally exhaust the manipulator, and in very serious cases, this may lead to even your own death. Next, myun refers to the size of a bang. Specifically, it refers to the surface area that Shinszu is spread out across. It can be said that the wider the myun one can control, the wider area in which Shinszu can be applied. Those who can control a large myun are the closest to what the traditional wave controllers were, those who control the flow of the battlefield. However, because one can control a wide myun does not inherently mean one can manipulate a certain concentration of Shinszu within that myun. Normally, the center of a myun has the highest concentration of Shinszu, and the circumference has the lowest concentration, kind of like a reverse tornado. Next, Su refers to the concentration or mass of Shinszu within the bangs, or basically its power. The higher the Su, the more effective and destructive a bang will be. This is why controlling a high Su is extremely important in battle. Normally, the denser the Shinszu in the environment, the faster the Su in a bang can increase, as all you have to do is pack your bang with the strong Shinszu that is already in the area around you. However, of course, there is a limit to the amount of Su that can be pressed into a bang, and this limit really just depends on the person. And if one even has a very good mental concentration, it is possible to manipulate a high Su of Shinszu within a very small bang as well. And finally, tension is basically how consistent your Shinszu is. I like to think of it as your Shinszu stamina. You can pack a lot of power in a concentrated area for a long amount of time without it losing any strength no matter how long you use it. This is why abilities like an orb are best to use when you have a high tension, because you can use Shinszu for a very long time and with consistent power. And now that we finished that, I think that is everything that we really needed to talk about involving Shinszu. Of course, like I said, there are Shinszu qualities, but I explained those way more in detail in its own dedicated video. So it's just probably better to go see that one, as again, not only do I not want to boggle this video up with information that I've already talked about, but also I would have had to probably do it in a shorter format, where in that video I just went more in depth into every single type of Shinszu quality that existed in the story at that point. But getting that out of the way, that's everything we know about Shinszu so far, and who knows, maybe we'll learn a little bit more about Shinszu and its details in the new Yurik Mizuno story, as that's going to be taking place in the second floor, with all these things like Shinszu and positions being a little more in depth again in the story, as we're probably going to be relearning a lot of the things we already knew from season 1. But now with all that being said, I hope you guys liked the video, and remember, I'm always going to be here to give you guys the truth, and if the truth isn't always explained, I'm always going to be here to give you guys my opinion on the truth. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.